There was information about the number of those Russian invaders who disguised themselves as civilians there, and about how many of them were present in the city itself. The president of Ukraine also spoke about this. As of this evening, what can we currently disclose regarding the Pokrovsk direction and the city of Pokrovsk itself?
Well, I would really like to start with Air Assault Forces Day, because today it is the 7th Air Assault Corps that is holding the defense on the Pokrovsk direction of the armed forces of Ukraine, and the most important wish is that all our people stay alive and return home alive. As for the Pokrovsk direction, indeed today it is, as always, probably at the peak of informational attention, and I absolutely agree that there is a lot of different information coming from various sources, some of which are truly aware of the situation. But it is very limited in terms of tactical details. There is more operational information, but accordingly there is also a lot, primarily of course from the Russian side, although some Western media have also rushed to declare the city occupied with loud headlines. So Russian disinformation is really appearing every minute today, completely distorting the actual situation unfolding in the Pokrovsk direction, particularly in the city of Pokrovsk itself, and accordingly in Myrnograd as well, because it's a single agglomeration. We're seeing that they are truly interconnected, and the successes or failures of our troops in one location are mirrored in the other, which exists in parallel but essentially shares the same fate. Indeed, if we're talking about the key moment that we're witnessing today, sector in which fighters from the Ukrainian Volunteer Army are also taking part. I would like to say that the most important thing today is that the defensive operation of the armed forces of Ukraine in the city of Pokrovsk is ongoing. Today, many people are asking questions about whether or not certain operations, including those that have been carried out and are still ongoing, have played their part. Our special units, primarily the main intelligence directorate, the security service of Ukraine, the special operations forces and other special forces have indeed managed, from a tactical standpoint, to achieve two objectives, tactical and strategic. Tactically, they were able to reclaim positions north of the city of Pokrovsk itself, and from Pokrovsk take a position from the enemy, thereby impacting logistics, which to a large extent is indeed under the fire control of the Russian occupiers. However, this is not physical control. And today it was possible to create some alternative, albeit small, logistical corridors through which troops can still be supplied. It is clear that our main priority today is to preserve the lives of our units and to carry out the tasks that our defenders continue to fulfill on these front lines. Accordingly, there are several possible scenarios for how events may unfold, but all of them are based on the fact that the city of Pokrovsk is, to a large extent now, a continuous and very large grey zone, as is in fact the entire Pokrovsk-Myrnograd agglomeration. I won't dwell on the most negative scenario, it's obvious, and Russian occupiers' information operatives are already skillfully working on it, unfortunately stirring up some panic as well. They are managing to spread this, including among Ukrainian society, and that is the main concern. There is a certain, let's call it a conditionally neutral scenario, meaning that the situation will not change drastically in the coming days. However, it is developing very dynamically, and even as we speak, the situation may be changing on one or another section of the Pokrovsk front. Accordingly, the gray zone nearby, literally just 10 to 15 meters apart in different neighborhoods, you can have Ukrainian defenders and Russian occupiers side by side. Nevertheless, there is also an alternative scenario for how events might unfold. I'm not saying that it will be possible to fully retake the city of Pokrovsk today or even tomorrow, but let's say there are still some notes of optimism. I've already mentioned them in particular about how our special forces have been at work. The special forces, about how they are continuing this operation. It's still too early to draw conclusions about how they have carried out and are continuing to carry out their mission. However, the main thing is to preserve the lives of our soldiers. That remains a steadfast priority accordingly. We understand perfectly well that this serious stronghold of Ukrainian defense in the Donetsk region plays an important role today. However, I'm even prepared for the fact that I will be criticized and that people will talk about this on social media. I want to say that even with a possible development of the situation that is not very favorable for us, today it is very important to choose our words carefully, as viewers will judge how wrong they are. So we definitely won't be seeing the horsemen of the apocalypse, because the war won't end here, life won't end here, and Ukraine will still continue its strategic defensive operation and will keep fighting for our land. In any case, today we are saying that Pokrovsk, of course, does influence the situation in the Donetsk region. However, if something not very pleasant happens for us, something that, let's say, would collapse the entire front, create attempts, or rather not just attempts, but actual conditions for a breakthrough of the front. All of this does not correspond to reality. And here it is very important that first and foremost, Ukrainian politicians or those people who have the opportunity to speak on air or on social networks, they have a large audience, so they should comment on what is happening in Pokrovsk very carefully and cautiously. In any case, the decisions made on the ground by the High Command today, I won't say they are the only correct ones, but they are based on the situation that is unfolding on the battlefield. And only those senior commanders who, I emphasize, have a complete understanding of the entire situation in Pokrovsk are able to assess the situation and make the appropriate decisions. The fighting continues, the situation is extremely difficult, but the defensive operation by Ukrainian forces is ongoing.
Serhiy, let's add just a bit more information about what remains now and about what is happening at the present moment in Pokrovsk. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky gave some figures. In particular, the head of state noted that the main goal of the Russian forces is to capture the city as quickly as possible in order to promote the narrative that Russia will supposedly be able to seize the entire Donbass. Let me remind you, these are the words of the President of Ukraine. The head of state also noted that in just the last 3 days, there have been 220 recorded attempts to advance on the city of Pokrovsk. According to Ukrainian military data, there are currently 314 occupiers in the city itself. The Russian army remains significant on the outskirts and continues to exert pressure. Let's listen to a direct statement and then continue our discussion.
For Russia, it is very important to do everything possible to actually capture Pokrovsk in any way, in order to show success on the battlefield. Whether it's Vovchansk or something else, they need to demonstrate success. Then they will be able to try to reclaim the narrative. We said we would capture Donbass.
Well, obviously the Russian Federation also has propaganda goals, and this is probably mentioned from time to time when they display their tricolor flag here and there, sometimes dropping it from drones, sometimes trying to plant it somewhere to create a certain image. But here it's probably not just about the image. 220 assaults in 3 days, they're clearly in a hurry for something. Honestly, I can assume that this might be related to changing weather conditions, or perhaps in urban combat this factor doesn't play a role.
It's quite possible that there are, if not agreements, then at least communications about some kind of high-level meeting. With the participation, first and foremost, of course, we're talking about the President of the United States. And it's quite likely that the Russian Federation is currently looking for ways to organize such a meeting with the world's #1 war criminal, Vladimir Putin. It's quite possible, and that's one of the reasons why today they're trying to create this image, not just an image actually. I'll just mention one figure to remind you. There are 150,000 Russian troops concentrated in the Pokrovsk direction. This isn't a 1,000-kilometer front, it's much smaller. You can actually calculate and measure just how many Russian occupiers are concentrated per square meter of Ukrainian land there. Yes, there are already many of them in our land, rotting, and they will continue to rot. Those ahead, the ones storming, will meet the same fate, destruction. I can even predict it without needing a body bag. Nevertheless, one can only imagine the concentration of forces and resources there. 150,000 personnel alone. That's why it's quite obvious that the Russians will hurry. Just as we have easily verified in our broadcasts, we said that today the main task of the Russians in all directions is to try to enter our settlements. So, accordingly, basically by the names of the directions, and to try to start urban combat there, in order, among other things, to spend the winter to conduct defensive or offensive battles of various types, tactical, operational, tactical, but in urban areas, even if destroyed, it's still not an open field. And in fact, on other fronts, if we talk about the front as a whole, we really do see this kind of situation. The settlement that the President of Ukraine mentioned, Volchansk, we're talking about other directions as well. We can also recall Lyman today and also Kupiansk. Although it's quite possible that on some sections of the front, this is not for... I do not have the right to make such statements. Nevertheless, it is quite possible that the Russians, intoxicated by the blood of their own compatriots and believing in, albeit a hard-fought victory near Pokrovsk, could find themselves in a completely different situation, in another location, also destroyed and with completely different results. Let's not rush things. I hope that well, let's put it this way, creativity, probably the right word, of our command post. First and foremost, the general staff is currently sufficient to operate on other sections of the front, enough today to repeat, for example, a situation that could probably be compared to the Dobropilya direction or others. So without any announcements, without naming locations, but as always, we believe in and trust our defense forces. This is an extremely difficult time for us, for both, for the rear front as well as for the direct line of contact. That's why it's clear today that our informational unity is also very important. And thank you for working together, as they say, like one orchestra with no one playing out of tune.
Serhiy, I also want to ask you, not the way you sometimes ask, like, what's the situation in Zaporizhzhia? No, I want to ask whether the Russian occupiers actually have enough resources today to launch a more large-scale offensive and expand the geography of their invasion and seizure in the Zaporizhzhia direction. Because obviously, first of all, I want to ask you, is the main goal actually the city of Zaporizhzhia itself, or is there no such objective? The main objective for the Russian occupiers here is to continue their actions in other directions as well, particularly in the Zaporizhzhia direction. This is done in order to draw Ukrainian forces there so that the armed forces of Ukraine are engaged in that area and so on. So regarding the Zaporizhzhia direction, if we
can describe the situation, what is the key objective for the occupiers there?
In fact, I have to answer, as I am about to, the main goal of the occupiers remains all of Ukraine. And no one is going to come up with anything new here. These are obvious things. As for the Zaporizhzhia direction, just like the others, indeed here, centers of tension have been created and continue to be created. And we're talking about significant tension, including on the Zaporizhzhia front, where the enemy is not just trying to demonstrate its activity, but is also trying to hold back our troops. This is absolutely true. It's also quite likely that they're preventing us from redeploying some of our reserves. Nevertheless, their activity is aimed at making advances. To advance forward as much as possible, as far as is possible today, because we understand perfectly well that the situation at the front, in any case, things are still not turning out for the Russians the way they would like, and as has been the case during almost 4 full years of large-scale occupation in Ukraine. In fact, the situation around Pokrovsk was difficult. You may recall that, at least emotionally and in terms of information, it seemed no less difficult more than a year ago when we were also talking about Pokrovsk. That's why the Zaporizhzhia front is active. The enemy is really trying to act not just actively, but also to use infiltration tactics today. This has become the main approach for the Russians. This is something they have managed, so to speak, to implement in their troops, and unfortunately it works up to a certain point, but it does work nonetheless. So once again, I want to emphasize that this activity will not be limited to the Zaporizhzhia front. We can also talk about attempts elsewhere of the enemy to get into the rear of our Huliaipol group. Here we're talking about the Alexandrovsk direction of the front, and we can say the same about the Orekhov direction, the Primorsk direction, and Stepnogorsk. These are the vectors that really define the movement of the Russian occupiers toward the city of Zaporizhzhia. However, here I think the situation is not just about this particular activity, but also about attempts to create a more cohesive line of combat engagement, probably a more classic one, you could even say. And accordingly, it is quite likely that they will continue to act along this line of advance, this line of activity, already using various means of firepower, including more active artillery, aviation, and all other types of fire that the Russians can use against Ukraine today.
Sergei, we have little time left, but still, the other directions remain quite tense as well. In the General Staff's report, there are far fewer assaults than in Pokrovsk, for example, but nevertheless, these assaults are happening. And there too, the occupiers, as I understand it, are trying to advance. Overall, how would you characterize the situation right now? We literally have about a minute and a half left. Other sections of the front? Can we say that the enemy has now, so to speak, set its priorities in favor of the Pokrovsk direction and has reduced its activity elsewhere?
The Donetsk region was initially a priority for the offensive actions of the Russian occupiers. They have demonstrated this. Nevertheless, today we are seeing fewer clashes. However, this may also be due, at least in part, to the regrouping of Russian troops in order to make the most effective use of the forces and resources available to them. They are not just showing activity, but are also conducting offensive operations in other directions as well. In fact, I have already mentioned some of them, but this is how we can generally characterize the entire line of contact. In some areas less, in others more, but overall the general characteristic is maneuvering, regrouping, and the accumulation of reserves. It is quite likely that the enemy is trying to do just that,